His final words made them billions. By that boy Ballen. Man, you can't make billions without being known. At least I don't think so. This has got to be somebody that's well known or a well known company. Let's get into it. Can we get into it?
Today, we're going to look at 3 stories about real people who at some point in their lives made choices. Now, at the time, these choices were fairly innocuous, but eventually those choices would completely change not only their lives, but millions of other people's lives as well. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format,
yes, sir,
then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's phone and change the names of all their contacts to just say spam, so that every call they get, they think it's spam and they don't answer.
That's decent.
Also,
That's
please
decent.
subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Famous last words.
On January 17th, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run and not go inside of this factory. But Gary was not about to run. He'd been waiting for months for this, and he was ready. So Gary, along with the guards at his sides, made their way towards the factory, and then without any hesitation, Gary stepped inside. And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it, nothing. It was just basically this massive empty space and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair.
This man is in the electric chair. A factory? They do this at factories? That's crazy.
So without even being told, he just began walking across the floor towards it. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. And once Gary was sitting, the guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair so he couldn't move. And as they did this, Gary didn't put up a fight. He just sat there staring straight across to the other side of this factory. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of the space. It was like this big curtain, like somebody had wheeled out like this massive curtain that was protecting something on the other side. And as he was staring at this curtain that was sort of perpendicular to him, he saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each—
Oh, that boy got the firing squad. Gary, what did you do? Oh, you a menace. Yeah, a firing squad? How much does a firing squad cost, bro? The cost of an execution by firing squad can vary depending on the state and circumstances. An estimated cost of $750,000. Oh, this is to renovate an entire cell block. That's not what I'm looking for. This is AI. The average cost of death penalty case was $3.1 million. Good gosh. That's one case? Back to Gary, man. Gary, what did you do, boy?
each station, there was a police officer armed with a rifle. They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. So Gary was a convicted—
He requested? What? Let's see what he did. Hold on.
Firing squad that Gary himself had requested. So Gary was a convicted murderer, and he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. His death sentence had gotten a lot of media coverage, and immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along—
Hold on, bro. Murder is terrible. But I don't even think the worst of the worst serial killers got firing squads. Did he say something to somebody? Mother of Gilmore appeals for Supreme Court stay. Hold on, I'm going to skim this real quick. So basically his mom is just asking about the constitutionality of said death penalty. And she wants it to be rethought over, you know, legal matters so that her son has more time and that maybe they X the death penalty and don't give it to him.
With the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But while Gary appreciated their efforts, he actually did not want that. He did not want, to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the only alternative to the death sentence, is life without parole. And that sounded horrible.
Yeah, man. I mean, if you had to ask me, bro, Life in prison? Death? I don't think I want life in prison, bro. That is terrible.
And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution, and he was very specific about how he wanted to die. He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him. And so after the guards had...
It got granted too. Like, I don't know, man. Like, if the murderer wants to die, you probably should not kill him and make him suffer. But then again, it does cost taxpayer money to keep him in jail. So, but then we saw the death penalty was like, what, 3.1 million? That is AI though. I don't know how accurate that is.
finished strapping Gary into the chair, squad, and that had been granted to him. And so after the guards had finished strapping Gary into the chair, they backed off, and then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready, and then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise who was hopefully looking to expand, and they were leaning on Dan and his team to help them do that. And while Dan certainly believed that this company had the chance to be huge, he just felt like they lacked something. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so this meeting that Dan was having right now with his colleagues was their attempts at coming up with, what can we do? What kind of campaign can we run for this company? And so for hours, they sat there pitching different ideas, different concepts of how we can elevate this brand. But it was like, even though a lot of ideas seemed promising, nothing really felt right. Everything just sort of felt like, maybe that would help. There was no slam dunk idea, at least.
Yeah, ideas are very good. Ideas obviously are very, very hard to come by, bro.
Not yet. And so as Dan is beginning to get frustrated, realizing he really doesn't have any great ideas yet, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, Dan does not understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. In fact, this campaign was so successful, it literally doubled this company's business practically overnight.
What?
And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world.
So it is $1 billion business, I'm assuming now from the title. What? I have no idea, bro. Let's see.
The slogan that Dan created as part of this very famous campaign was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words. Just do it.
Oh!
Dan's client, that small business, was Nike.
Nike is from the Nike slogan is from the execution of a man. And how many years ago, bro? What? Of all the Nike stuff that I put on, bro, I had no clue. Bro, that is crazy. So this man, butterfly effect like crazy, bro. I mean, technically you can say Nike is successful because of a murder. That is a crazy statement. I gotta charge my headphones. Hold on. Yo, bro, how did I not hear this before, bro?
Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballen Studios
That
called
is
Redacted,
crazy.
Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna. and so far you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories.
I might have to watch those. Start watching those. W Mr. Ballen for putting the homies on, man. You love to see it. Story 2, The Shiner. Somebody shining shoes, bro?
One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris.
What you mean not romantic, bro? If I take a girl out to McDonald's, bro, she better be happy. She better be proud. That's hard-earned $5. I worked hard to get that $5, bro. You better enjoy this kid's meal. You little happy toy. Better enjoy it.
In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do. And so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, is this okay? And she kind of looked back and smiled like, I get it, it's fine, we can eat here. So
that's
they
what's
hopped
up.
in
That's
line
what's up.
and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table. And then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here. And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, sure, go ahead. And so,
Hey, W random stranger. But at the same time, forcing a random stranger into a random third wheel is crazy. That is crazy work.
Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine. But as they were eating and chatting, Chris, his mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about.
Right.
In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't.
Makes
so he
sense.
found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. And
It ain't no wonder he wanted you to sit there. He got some weird stuff going on. Let's see.
the way he's looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview, and he looks at this guy and he's like, what's going on? Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date, insulting the way she looked, insulting.
Nah, bro. Nah, I knew something was up. I didn't know something was up, but I kind of figured something. I didn't. That's weird. Why you do that? We gotta fight now. We have to. You can't belittle me in front of my date like this and start insulting her. Unless maybe he's doing it on purpose, gets beat up on purpose, and that way Chris looks even better in front of his date. You don't know.
The way she talked, and Chris is like, what's going on here? He's looking at his date like, did I miss something? You know, remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago, but then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, you're an ugly pig.
Did Chris's date know this man? Nah, she wouldn't have agreed to sit there then. What? All right, let's keep going.
Eventually, this guy, he says to Chris's date, "You're an ugly pig." And at this, Chris is like, "I can't just sit here." And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, "Hey man, get up." Like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake. Because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature.
Oh man.
And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor here.
Yeah.
And he kind of looks up at this guy and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's.
Bro, not only do you take an L by going to McDonald's on the first date, I don't know if it's the first date, but on a date, you didn't get your ass beat. You gotta walk away. There's no more dating her, bro. There's no more. You're done.
I just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point and he kept apologizing to his date and she's like, "No, it's fine." And they just wanted to get out of there. And so they left the McDonald's and they both, went to their respective homes. And Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning, when Chris got up early, because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom and he looked in the mirror and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, I mean, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? "Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night." There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, "You know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident."
Chris, you gotta get some makeup, bro. You gotta get makeup. Go back to the girl. Maybe she'll fix you up, bro. Put some makeup on. But then again, your eye is still swollen, so you can say you got stung by a bee.
Like, "You know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome." So fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long, he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good, but it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward.
Yeah, you just kind of want to get past it at that point. Just like, hey, let's acknowledge it and then we move on, bro.
Staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and by the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity and he left thinking, "I'm not going to get the job." However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye.
What?
Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights, and they're thinking, "Oh my goodness, he can hit his lines, he's got the charisma, and look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy." So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in—
Is that Chewbacca? Star Wars?
became one of the most popular TV shows
in
the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. I mean, he truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones.
I haven't seen Game of Thrones, but I know, bro. I really thought that was Chewbacca. Leave me alone. 1 drink, 2 drink. Oh, man.
One night in 1925, a 21-year-old college student named Ted was inside of his dorm room at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, surrounded by his friends. Ted and his friends had gotten their hands on a bottle of gin, and so tonight they were just sitting around, drinking this gin and having a great time. Now, Ted and his friends knew this was not allowed. I mean, literally they knew this was illegal. It didn't matter that they were 21 years old. At the time, in the United States in 1925, the country was in the middle of prohibition, which meant no one was allowed to possess or consume alcohol. It was actually illegal. But Ted specifically was willing to take that risk because tonight he wanted to celebrate. Ted was a senior in college and was getting ready to graduate with honors. And also, he had recently been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine called Jack-O-Lantern. This was a big deal for Ted. I mean, he had aspirations of graduating and becoming a professional writer and publisher, and it just felt like everything was falling into place, getting this job as editor-in-chief. It was a huge accomplishment. So Ted took a swig from the bottle and passed it around the circle, and before long, he and his friends were all pretty drunk and having a great time, laughing and joking and telling stories.
Turned up, sipping on
gin and juice. It was a lot of fun. But at some point, they heard a knock on their door. And right away, Ted and his friends went silent, remembering that, oh my...
Throw the bottle, dump it, break it into a billion pieces, bro. Brush your teeth. Don't open that door until everybody's teeth has been brushed with a Clorox bleach.
My God, are we in trouble now? Ted said, no, it's fine. I'm sure it's just, more friends coming to stop by and hang out with us. And so Ted, he gets up, he goes to the door, and, his heart's racing a little bit because he doesn't know who's there. He opens the door, and it's not friends. It's two police officers. And so Ted and his friends all got busted for drinking alcohol. However, fortunately for them, the police did not press charges, and so nobody went to jail. And also the school, Dartmouth, decided not to expel Ted or any of his friends. However, they were dealt some pretty severe punishments. Specifically, Dartmouth stripped Ted of all of his academic honors and extracurriculars, which meant he was no longer the editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. In fact,
should that even be legal? I get getting kicked out, but you literally earned that. That's crazy.
He was told by the school that not only was he no longer the editor-in-chief, but he couldn't even submit to put anything in writing into that magazine. He was totally banned. Ted was heartbroken, less so about the academic honors and much more so about being, cut off from the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. He really had attached a lot of value to being the editor-in-chief. He felt like things were going in the direction of him graduating and becoming this professional writer, and so this was sort of a devastating blow. Ted considered fighting with Dartmouth to try to reinstate himself with the magazine, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew that was going nowhere. They were not going to change their mind. However, Ted was not quite ready to just totally give up on this magazine. He knew this magazine did accept submissions from the public, and so he thought, okay, well, I'm not allowed to submit anything to this magazine, but maybe if I come up with a different name, a pen name, then I can submit my work, they won't know it's me, and maybe I can get something published.
That boy finessing. Yeah, he's smart. He finessing.
And so that's exactly what Ted began doing. And the new editor-in-chief of this magazine had no idea this pen name was actually Ted. And so when they received the work from the pseudonym, they thought it was some new person they had never heard of. And they were so wowed by the work. They're like, this is great. And they began publishing all of Ted's work, not realizing it was his. And for Ted, oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name.
Goat milk is higher than ever. Yo, that goat got a big ass sack. I can't even. All right, let's keep going, bro. Let's keep going.
Oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name. He kind of liked this pen name. It kind of, fit the vibe of his writing. And so he just continued up with this ruse for the rest of the time he was at Dartmouth. And then after he graduated, he just continued to write under this pen name. Throughout the rest of his life, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books, all under this pen name. A name he came up with basically just because he got caught drinking in the dorm in college. These books would entertain and inspire generations of people, and in fact, he would even win a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to American literature and education. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but I'm sure you know him much better by his pen name.
What the fuck?
Which is Dr. Seuss.
What the fuck? Yo, these stories were fucking crazy, bro.
In case you haven't heard yet,
Dr. Seuss is an alcoholic. Bro, what? What? We got drunk Dr. Seuss before the next Elder Scrolls. Bro. Butterfly effect went crazy in this video. Crazy.
Our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited
Link in the
number
description
of
below,
hand-signed
bro,
copies
in this
available,
video
but
too.
those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the
Man. Dr. freaking Seuss. We have Dr. Seuss because of prohibition? Wild world we live in, bro. Wild timeline.